The latest Quinnipiac University poll has President Biden's approval rating at 49%. Democrats and Republicans mostly responding along party lines. Independents, though, were split. A Fox News poll has President Biden's overall approval a bit higher at 54%. Also in that Quinnipiac poll, 85% of Republicans said they prefer to see candidates running for office who mostly agree with Donald Trump. 53% of all respondents said they prefer to see candidates running who disagree with the former president. As for whether Joe Biden was legitimately elected, 64% say he was. However, 2/3 of Republicans believe he was not. So, Michael Steele, this is more evidence of what we've seen poll after poll after poll, which is that a vast majority of Republicans do not believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. They've bought into the lie that they've been fed by Donald Trump and through the media they consume.
Yeah, they have, and it's been a steady drumbeat reinforced by the likes of Kevin McCarthy and Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and others who presumably in leadership positions know better. But, that craven lust for power and grifting off of the fears and concerns of a lot of Americans out there, is the order of the day. So that's reflected in this poll. But I think the bigger and more important takeaway for me is beyond the Republican Party, and this speaks more, I think, to its future demise than its present sight on taking the House back next year, for example, is that the American people right now standing with the president that they have been unable to categorize, demonize, or otherwise vilify in a way that would move voters away from his policies and away from the president personally towards back to Donald Trump into his loving arms or to the Republican Party. So if I'm a state chairman, or if I'm a national chairman, I'm looking politically at the landscape. At some point, you have to take into account what the American people are telling you. And so I think, part of that answer or that accounting may come today when Republicans lay out their $1 trillion infrastructure plan and maybe begin this conversation to try to move people on policy as opposed to move them on the politics. We'll see. But right now, the politics, for them at least, they think work as reflected by the Republican numbers. The bigger problem is with the rest of the country, it doesn't.
Mike Barnicle is joining us as well, fresh back from the ballpark last night after a big Red Sox victory. Mike, you look at some of these numbers, Joe Biden holding around just over 50% in most public opinion polling, 49% in that Q poll. But the numbers from the Republican Party, though no longer surprising, are being sustained, and they're being sustained by people who are telling the lie, who are perpetuating the lie. When you have 2/3 of Republicans who say that Joe Biden is not the legitimately elected president of the United States, we should underline that 65% of all Americans say he is, but that's still an awful lot of Americans who do not accept the result of that presidential election.
Yeah, well, Willie, that is the former president's ultimate gift to America. A constant source of division, an almost daily source of division and contempt for the established order, for law, for the Constitution, for everything that the country stands for. Why? Because of his enormous ego and the fact that he can't tell the truth. So here we are, sitting in a country badly in need of repair. We're talking about the infrastructure stuff now, highways, bridges, new schools being built, airports being rebuilt, in order to contend and cope with the competition of the 21st century. And we have a permanent divisive force in American politics. And we have a permanent, seemingly, cadre of cowards in Congress, in the House, in the Senate, largely Republicans and their leaders. Kevin McCarthy, he can't be that ignorant. He cannot be that ignorant. But clearly, he is that cowardly. In order not to confront the truth. Once you confront the truth of what happened in the election last year, then the country's going to move forward, and the Republican Party might move forward with it. But I doubt that's going to happen, and I don't know what the future of the Republican Party is. I've been listening to Michael Steele now for about a week and a half, 2 weeks, whenever he's on, talking about the future of his party. I don't think there is a future for his party, the way it's currently constructed, with the basis of their beliefs. It's not there. It's just not there because it's not real.
Michael?
Yeah, no, I think Mike makes an excellent point, and which is why there is a battle line clearly drawn inside the party by the likes of Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and Adam Kinzinger, myself, and a host of Republicans who, is not so much fighting for the future of the party, but fighting for a set of principles that are important. Whether they reside inside of this thing called the GOP is another matter. So, the battle line is not over, oh, gee, do we have a Republican Party tomorrow? No, that's not what it's about. It's about, do we as citizens value the proposition founded by our forefathers all those years ago or not? This party seems to say that is of less value now. We are replacing that with this thing called Trump, which is what that poll reflects. We want a candidate who will agree with Donald Trump. Regardless of the bat-you-know-what crazy that comes out of his mouth, we want you to agree with it. We want you to stand with Margaret Taylor Greene with all that bat-you-know-what crazy. We want you to follow Josh Hawley in that, we're with you, insurrectionist kind of, authority. That's what they want. That's not democracy. And so someone's got to draw the line. It's easy to walk away, Willie. It's easy to walk away and say, I'm done with it, right? But then what? Because you let all of that fester. If there's no counter story, if there's no other narrative for the American people to understand why what you're seeing play out in this party is so wrong-headed, going in such a wrong direction, and is so damningly bad for the country, that gives it more license. It gives it more. And so if you don't have people with the label, with the R on their shoulder, making that case, it becomes harder when it's at a critical moment to pull Americans away from that level of stupid. That's why we look to the leaders initially who have failed us. That's why what Liz Cheney did is so important and why they hate it, because it got such a powerful counter narrative to the crap they're putting out there in front of the public right now with the big lie, the audits in Arizona, what they're trying to do in Michigan, et cetera.
And again, that number in the Quinnipiac poll is 85%. 85% of Republicans who want candidates who agree with Donald Trump. It's not much of a civil war when it's 85% against 10% or whatever is left there.